That's the birthday boy, Scott.
Oh.
Yeah. Scott, are you 21 already?
Almost.
All right, well, good.
Working on it.
So our movie this week is called Milagro Beanfield War. It's Robert Redford's second feature film and probably his least successful commercially, but just a marvelous story as he tries to talk to, let this community have a voice, this community of, 300 or 400 people, and he lets them try to speak something different. Because communities like that, how many have lived in a small community like that before?
That's small.
Communities like that, sometimes their voices seem very small in the midst of, right? And so the commercial pipeline, the voice of that is much louder than the protesters that are saying sacred land, right? It's that type of a space. Where is it that a small voice is getting overridden by a very powerful, strong, either politically or money-wise? So in the midst of that, where did you find God's voice? How did you hear God's voice in the midst of it?
I'm going to throw this out right away because I don't think anybody else will go for it. But to me, thinking about it, actually, God was the concertina player.
Yeah.
Kind of in the background, very quiet, but seemed like it made a lot of influence on the things that happened after the concertina player appeared.
Yeah. The challenge is this, though, Jenny, about that. Who was listening to the concertina player? Not most of them. Most
Not consciously, no.
right? And that's the hard part about it, because I think you're right. The concertina player was at least one representation of how larger than us speaks, but do we listen?
2 points I would like to mention. One is where the lawyer decides to defend Joe, and the other is when they destroy the big sign for the development.
And tell me why those were important to you.
Well, I think the big thing with the lawyer was that this was something he didn't want to do. He was afraid, and it was a momentous decision that made a difference in catalyzing the whole community, I think.
Yeah.
The sign, I think, was key in that it was where people stood up and dramatized that something bad was going on with the developers.
And did you ever get the question answered in your head about who set that on fire, as well as some of the other things?
The villagers. I think it was the villagers came together.
I think it was Amarante, the one who was listening to the concertina the most, the one who seemed least able to affect the community in some ways, right? Because he was kind of checked out of. I think it was him who was doing it. But in the listening, heard a voice that needed to be different than what everyone else was listening. Because everyone else is listening to voices of, I got to go do, this for my job, or I got to do this or whatever, right? The mayor is saying, yeah, we don't listen to voices that we don't want to. Right? If we haven't learned it by now, we're not going to listen to you now.
Yeah.
What he said to the social worker, right? Which is not untypical of us as human beings. But Amarante, that old man, was still listening to a voice that was different. So I think you're right. When that burnt, it changed things, didn't it? Go ahead, Diane.
Yeah, well, it occurs to me too, the young woman there that was encouraging the lawyer to get involved, she also heard the concertina player.
Yes, it never shows her listening to it, but she definitely heard some voice, didn't she?
Yeah.
And we all need a Ruby in our life like that, don't we? Somebody who spurs us on a little bit.
She was
part of the village.
but she was urging them to do what would be dangerous for the community to do.
She was, wasn't she?
Mhm.
And she knew the danger that was there, but I think she also saw the other danger, don't you?
Mhm.
The danger of the development company and what that would mean. The hard part about being that type of voice, because St. Francis has often been the ruby voice, right? The call out to the community, try to change the community. The problem is that, well, two problems. One, sometimes the community doesn't listen yet. Like after the meeting, and they all just got in a fight, and she said maybe it was too early. But the second thing is trying to figure out how to, in the midst of failure, keep voicing. Isn't that hard? Because if I say something you guys don't listen, it's much simpler for me to not say it the next time. Right? And you as well. We have to continually pluck up our courage sometimes to keep voicing what is the challenging thing. Go ahead, Catherine. You're muted.
This movie's like a sleeper in the sense that it can be understood, and I'm thinking I want to watch it again.
Yes.
Because I think there are nuances that you miss just if you're trying to enjoy it, like enjoy it on one level, because there's so many elements. There's humor, there's love, there's the themes of, you know, a particular lifestyle that people are trying to live, and values, and then the spiritual values. I loved, you know, just tapping into all the different things that were happening, and the government, you know, which, you know, is often, you know, just what's the word, slipshod in a sense, and trotting over people's rights, and not understanding people's cultures, not understanding the ways, and that there's ways to get things done. And then there are people that are just so rigid in their wanting to express or use the law or power. So there's a lot of meat in this very short film, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. Really, it was wonderful.
But that's because that type of thing happens on a regular basis. The biggest thing about, the biggest example of that here in Tucson, we talked about last week, where just south of downtown, we took out a whole neighborhood, an old historic neighborhood, in order to put up a community center, you know, a convention center. And the facility is a really good facility, and it makes us more modern as a city, but at what price? What got lost in the midst of that progress? And we often listen to the voice of progress much easier than to whatever's being lost in the midst of. Doris, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I think I saw God in whatever flashed that inspiration into Joe's mind to plant beans after he saw the water. And I think that Joe was a bit of a reluctant rebel.
Yeah.
I don't think he set out to plant a bean field in order to cause a huge community disturbance.
Yeah.
I think he just thought, my grandfather used to plant beans here, why don't I?
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden he's the figurehead of this movement. And I think that that's where I saw God in that calling,
Yeah.
even though he didn't
I
ask for it.
Yeah, I actually kind of like that as well. It was completely by accident. It was just his frustration that kicked that open, and all of a sudden he sees the water going, and it was just kind of like, damn, why don't I? Right? And so it's a bit of stubbornness, it's a bit of anger, it's a bit of frustration. That reluctant Messiah. Thank you, Doris.
But you know, water is life, and that was the whole thing. That's where God was in the life-giving water.
Yeah.
And so Joe, what was his name?
Mondragon.
Mondragon kicked it, but then later on, Bloom, the editor, kicked it again and realized this has to be done.
That's right.
What really,
Go ahead.
what really got to me was I just read an article in the Nature Conservancy magazine about the same thing happening up in Alaska with the salmon fishing. There was this mine that Canadians found, I think, a long time ago, wanting to drill down in there. If they do it, it's going to ruin the salmon fishing for this village. They provide salmon for all of us. And so there's some want to get the jobs because it's going to make them money, but most of the villagers are raising flags just like there. So it was so current to me to read that.
But Sandy, that's because it's an ongoing story that happens again and again. You know, the village that's being displaced by that, I don't know what the monetary purpose, I mean, equivalence would be, but let's say it's worth $1. The line going through would probably be worth $10, you know, much more valuable. So why do we care about that little bit of loss? Well, it's not a little bit of loss for that village.
No.
For Milagro, it's not a bit of loss. It's a whole bunch of loss.
Yeah.
Some of it not being able to be measured by.
Mm-hmm.
But yet we easily write that off, don't we?
It's like from the Bible, David and Goliath. This is the story of it.
It is kind of that same type of story, isn't it?
Yeah.
And when is it our job to stand up for the small voice, the small interest, instead of going along with the large interest?
With God's help, we'll do it.
Somehow or another, right?
Yeah.
And the hard part is like Bloom, who was another reluctant Messiah, right? He had to decide if he goes back into the fray one more time. He'd done lots of those types of cases. He'd lost lots of those types of cases. And so does he go one more time?
Yeah.
Catherine.
Yeah, well, and it seems to me the interesting thing is each the men and the women too, but the men that were more the main characters, like the sheriff and some of the others, they all had to do like self-examination about where do I fit in the scheme of things? Where am I? Who am I in the midst of this? And then I keep thinking of how decisions get made in DC or by people that know nothing about the moment.
Right.
And the immediacy, and how we wreak havoc with other people's lives. And maybe we have to look at that yet again. And I think it's just it's such a basic lack of understanding that we have about one another. And I think we can tie it in with the racial issues, with the cultural issues, and with even in different communities in our country, there are values and traditions and things that are meaningful that make a community strong or unique, or what it is, the roots of that community. And I think that there's just a real wholesale failure to address that and to understand the value of difference, of being different and unique.
You're exactly right. But that's where somebody like a Sheriff Bernie has to be very strong, because Bernie could walk between the village and the spaces of power, and he could essentially say, Yeah, let me tell you, let me give a different perspective on that.
Right.
And didn't he do a relatively good job about not insulting the governor or the other people of power, but also saying, here's why it's not going to work, or here's what you've overlooked, or whatever.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's exactly the perspective that we have to give to others. So yeah, so it makes me always have to go, where is it that in my life I'm supposed to do that? So in 2019, when we had our general conference, I sat with my friend Felipe. Now I knew Felipe when he was just Felipe. Now he's Obispo Felipe, right? Bishop Felipe. He's the Bishop of Northern Mexico. And I sat with him and he spoke several times at the general conference against the movement towards an inclusive church. And I said, here's why it's difficult for our church. Here's why you need to know, no matter what it is that's making you vote one way, you need to know the effect that it has on me. Right? And I could do that as his friend, not as his political opponent.
Jim,
Yes.
as you tell that story, I'm curious about how he responded to what you said.
He did well. He listened. Felipe is an amazing man. I love who Felipe is. He's got a really good heart. He's also, in Northern Mexico, Methodism is a relatively conservative sect. And so he has his perspective of where he thinks theologically we should be. So I'm not certain I changed his mind, but he heard his friend speak. And I think that's part of what we have to do, is be in that space with people. So they can't just write all of so-and-so off as whatever they want to write it off as. But I think that's instructive in all of our things. We easily write each other off, don't we? But if we can be in a space of relationship, which is where Bernie was at, he was in a space of relationship where he could say, let me help. And he did that with Joe as well, didn't he? Kind of spoke as cousin.
Yeah.
So what else did it bring up for you? What does it tell us about ourselves as human beings and what we have to do and be?
Well, I think from my perspective, it's repeatedly, I have choice points in my life, not just once or twice, but again and again, who am I? What do I feel? What do I believe? And how do I live my faith?
Yeah.
What am I called to do? And how does this support my belief system when I think about myself in a particular way? Is that in harmony with that, or is there a conflict there? And then how do I make sense of it all?
Yeah. And there's no doubt that in this story there were conflicts. If you think about a small village like that, obviously not a very well-to-do community, then the sense of maybe this will bring jobs. Maybe this will give me a good job. But you saw right at the beginning where Joe said, I'm a good framer. Can you give me work? And they told him no. And the only time work developed for Joe was when? You're muted, Randy, but I think you were right.
When he was offered a bribe, essentially.
That's right. When it was politically expedient for them to give him work. Right? And so that job, that offering of resources, whatever it is, sometimes comes with a price. often comes with a price.
Well, I
I
think
think
that,
for us, one of the big things is how to be aware. If you look at that community, the people there had a level of awareness of what was going on, varied between the people, and then the developers, that whole group, were seeing the advantages of what could be done there.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing everybody else in the surrounding area was oblivious to
Yeah.
the situation, affected by it, but not even knowing that they would be affected by it, and not caring and not motivated to be involved in any way.
Yeah, I loved the image of the three old guys in the back of the truck with the guns
Yeah.
pointed at the Forest Service, right?
Yeah.
They had some clue of why it was important, didn't they?
Well, they were protecting Joe too, so
They
that
were.
showed the mutual affection, at least, and love, probably in a village like that.
And I loved when the guy went over there and said, so if I have him put down his gun, what will you do? We'll shoot him.
We shoot him. Yeah, got a real straight answer.
And sometimes that's what has to happen, is somebody has to say, here's a truth.
Mhm.
Sorry if it's an inconvenient truth.
Jim,
Yes, Margie.
just a couple of people ago, you said something about the job coming with the price. One of the characters that I really thought was interesting, and I don't know his name, and he and Joe had an exchange earlier. He was with one of the government groups. I want to say the Forest Service. I don't remember, but they were friends as children. But then when they grew up, he got a job
Oh, yeah.
with whoever it was, but he was the guy at the end that saves Joe's life. He's with what's his the guy that was chasing
Shorty?
I think it was Bernie. I think it was the sheriff.
Yeah,
I think that's what
okay,
you're
the
talking about.
sheriff.
Right.
And he that's Bernie.
I
Okay.
think so.
So he is with the group that's chasing Joe, right? And he ends up
Oh no, you're talking about a whole different other guy. You're talking about, what was his name? Shorty.
Shorty, okay.
Shorty, yes.
Okay. He ends up saving Joe's life, and then at the very end, he's one of the ones who he kind of changes his allegiance at the end and
Yeah.
stands with the town right at the very end when they're kind of having that standoff.
Yeah.
And I just found that an interesting character.
It
He
is an
sort of
interesting
forgot who he was, he forgot his roots, but then he came back to it at the end.
Yeah, and the tough part is that many of us have to do that type of thing. What is the most important here? And the hard part is we often have to fight through our financial interests. This will give me a job. This will help the community around us. This will bring in a lot of commerce. But you had to remember, but the deeper thing is, and in some ways it was the spiritual roots rather than the financial or the economic or the cultural things. It was the spiritual side of things that they were having to fight for, right? Which has a more ethereal quality to it. How do you put a value to that? Diane?
Yeah, Jim, I was thinking that maybe the spiritual roots were represented in the beans that were growing in the field, and they were flourishing, they looked healthy, and that was so much in contrast to the bulldozers rooting out the natural habitat there. And then here were these little green sprouts that were so healthy and encouraging.
Yeah. And I love, Diane, that it never really showed fully grown plants. Even when they were picking the things, those were not the right size plants for being
That's right.
picked
Yeah.
yet.
I know.
Because it was still showing a lot of very dry land around there,
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
right? And that's often where we have to find growth, is in very dry land,
Mhm.
don't we?
Yeah.
And we have to celebrate this size of a crop rather than what we wish it was or what we really need. Because they needed not just one bean field in that community.
Oh, no.
But that was the beginning.
That was the beginning,
Mhm.
right? So go ahead, John.
Well, it changes, shifts the subject a little bit.
That's good.
I want to know the meaning of the pig. She was beautiful.
Yeah. You know, the hard part about something like that is in every story, there are things that are uncontrollable. And Lupita was definitely one of those types of elements, right? When he came and he saw Lupita in that corner, he thought Lupita had caused that instead of the bulldozer that really had. But the thing of it is that those uncontrollable elements could eat the beans.
Yeah.
Right.
That's right.
And so we often get focused on something like Lupita instead of seeing that it was the guy from the development company.
Mhm.
We often get distracted from what really needs to be done. And often, one of my favorite lines from this whole thing is what Nancy, Joe's wife, said. Why is it every time we're mad at someone else, we end up shooting ourselves?
Yeah, that was a profound observation.
And it's because the Lupitas we get caught up in something that is a side thing, right?
Yeah, that's part of it.
And it's not that it's not unimportant completely, because if a pig's rooting around in your beans, you do need to figure out something, but it's not the major problem there, was it? But he never saw the bulldozer because bulldozer went off the side of the cliff before he got there.
Yeah. You know, that statement of Joe's wife applies very precisely also to the hate you give.
Yeah.
Yes, it does, doesn't it?
So there's a continuing theme here. It's
Yeah.
almost like they've been chosen for that, huh?
But in reality, that is much of what I believe is the gospel that Jesus preached, was a lot of the, why are you looking at things that are not as important instead of things that are more important, right? Why are we focusing on stuff that is light in the world instead of that which are the weightier matters, he said at one point.
I'd like to comment about the ritual and the offering that was given and his conversation, because I really liked that scene and the nod to traditions and the humbleness, and I don't have tamales, but this is what I have. This is what I offer. This is what I give. And I'm getting the goosebumps even as I'm speaking about it. It's like the real importance of having, you know, so to me, the importance that I think maybe we're finding again now is simple ceremonies and rituals, and like Sunday when it was time to do the, you know, the bread and wine and do the communion. I had, somebody had given me some sangria, so I went and poured a little bit of that, and even though it was 10 o'clock in the morning, but no matter. And then I had something else that was just very simple, that was for the bread. And just those things that we do, that we can do even at home, or the things that we do alone, but that we sometimes can do communally, how valued that is in our life, comfort that it brings.
You know, Catherine, on my pastor pages, pastors are arguing about whether that's real communion or not, right? Because we're not controlling it, and because we're not doing it with, or all of that type of stuff. And yet I think that sacrament was given in a way that was very clear. Wherever you are, whatever bread is in front of you, whatever juice you're drinking, that's the presence of God with you. And the hard part is that that's an uncontrollable thing, right? And as a church, we often try to control things, right? As do most organizations that are larger, right? We're trying to tell that meta story, that larger story, instead of seeing the individual story and controlling you, because who knows what you're going to do if you start turning that bread into God.
Ooh.
Right? What story will you start telling? And the reality is Jesus was very okay with that. Go tell the story that God is placing in your heart, not the story that I think God should place in your heart. Go ahead, Doris.
One of the characters that I found really interesting that we haven't mentioned yet is the researcher guy from NYU.
Yeah, Daniel Stern's character. His name is Herbie.
Yeah,
Herbie Plant.
and how he was looking at everything that happened there from a sociological, investigative viewpoint about, tell me about why you have the candle and so on. And then at the end, when Amarante got shot and he's in his little hovel lighting candles and praying for him, this guy who was so objective in the beginning, but he somehow the power of that soaked into him, and I just thought there was a really interesting development there.
And what I like is kind of where we saw it develop, is that he's walking towards Amarante, who we see in the scene before is talking to the concertina player, right? And Herbie's coming up going, there is nobody else here. He's just talking to himself. And yet he chooses to come in and say, can I sit down and talk with you? So whoever he thought Amarante wasn't enough to drive him away.
Yeah.
And we do a whole lot of driving ourselves away, making the choice to drive ourselves away because who knows what voice they're listening to.
I think Herbie was just continuing the syncretism that he pointed out at some point in the movie, that the veneration of the saints that Amarante was engaging in was just a Catholic overlay on some pre-existing pantheistic spiritualism.
Yeah.
And he brought science to it and wound up, becoming, yet another layer on top of that tradition. Yeah.
And another movie that really deals with that subject really well is the movie Contact.
What is it?
Contact. It was from the late 90s. Yeah. And the main character there is very much a scientist, but then is brought into a spiritual world and has to figure out, how do I take these two pieces together? So you're right that Bernie was an example of how do you merge these two sometimes competing things. And to be fair, church has been really good at setting ourselves in opposition to science. Mm-hmm. And it shouldn't be that way. They are complementary disciplines if we let them be.
I thought the movie was a classic Western, the big versus the small, the just substitute the cattle ranchers and the sheep herders. But I think that was what's also disturbing to me about the movie in relation to spiritualism, is that ultimately, like in the Westerns, the appeal was ultimately to the gun.
Yeah.
Who had the most guns?
That's the hard part, isn't it?
Yeah, very hard. And like I say, underneath all of those movies is the notion of scarcity and greed.
Yeah.
Scarcity and greed.
And
And I think in terms of what the message of the movie is for us as Christians, it's contained in, the confrontation of the sometimes characterized as the wealthy man or the prince with Christ. What do I need to do to be saved? Sell all you have and give it to the poor.
yeah,
And goes away disturbed, not happy with that answer.
Yeah.
And nor would we be.
no. And Robert Redford, the director, knew that type of story. He also knew the stories I think there's a reason why he set it in a small town in New Mexico, because the stories of New Mexico are filled with that same story of fighting over water. Okay. The stories of Billy the Kid, that whole battle was over water. So I don't think it was very well chosen
Mm-hmm.
to do it the way he did it and setting it where he set it.
And ultimately, that's going to be a macro issue that we all confront.
Yeah.
Scarce. I mean, there's plenty of fresh water, but it's not all in the right places.
That's right. I mean, today on my phone, there's a story that I haven't read yet about how Arizona approved giving water to somebody, right? Diverting some of the water somewhere. And I haven't read it yet, but my friend Sid was chairperson of Central Arizona Project for years. And that's been a major issue, and it continues to be a growing issue. What do we do with the water from the Colorado River, for example? How are we going to use that? Who owns it, for example? In Yuma, where the Colorado River passes through, there's a place right downtown that everyone goes and swims. And it's a nice little park. It's a great little thing to say, you're in the Colorado River. And it's kind of sad because the water at that point is only about twice as far across as this office is, right? Maybe 20 feet across. But what's interesting about it is that all of that water is Mexican water. It's in Yuma, which is still 20 miles from the border, but all of the American water has already been diverted, and all the water that's still in the river at that point belongs to farmers and whatnot. The rights belong to farmers in Mexico.
Yeah, yeah.
So how you divide that water righting is really interesting. But isn't that true of a whole bunch of our other stuff? Who owns that which we call ours? Who owns the views in a national park? Who owns the mineral rights that might take away some of those views?
And the same question could be asked, who originally owned the land that we now live on?
Absolutely, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And we want to say we didn't steal it, but now we own it when it should have been owned by somebody else's descendants.
Mhm.
Right? But that's true of, in many ways, every single one of our minority groups. We whites have somehow benefited from exploitation of something that should have belonged to, or they should have gotten a bigger piece of the pie than what they received, and they didn't, and we did.
And all under the name of progress, which, that trumps everything else, doesn't it? Progress.
Because the development company could say, we're bringing in something wonderfully new here.
Yeah.
Right. But it means that those natives who have lived there, their families have lived there for maybe hundreds of years, suddenly don't have a place.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
Is it progress?
Well, and is progress inherently good?
And is progress inherently good?
No, we don't assess that. Now look at the world. It's being destroyed by its own progress.
That's right. Can I tell you one of my favorite things about the pandemic? I see animals more often because you guys are in your house and you're not scaring them away.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? There's not as many people here on campus, and so the jackrabbits are coming across the parking lot and coming over and looking around. And we forget every time we build a building, we displace somebody. And it may not be the town of Milagro. It may be the rabbit family that used to be at on this site. And we forget that.
Jim,
Yes.
one of my favorite parts was the beginning, where the concertina, the coyote angel, was kind of magically imaginary seen going through the land.
Yes.
And it reminded me of a class that we took from Ollie on fairy tales. And there's certain things in each fairy tale that you look for.
Yeah.
One is like an angel type person. One is a hero, a sidekick, which could be Bloom, or it could be Herbie Flat.
Yeah.
And then Lupita the pig is always a funny little animal.
Uh-huh.
I just one thing after another, and it always has a villain, of course, the divine. And it was just very magical to me too. And then the music all the way through sort of tied it all together.
Some of my favorite songs, by the way, like for example, they sang Celito Lindo, which was the very first Spanish song I ever learned. I was in 8th grade, Mrs. Frank's Spanish class, and I learned it well enough that I sing it to this day, not because I've learned it since, but because she taught it to me so well. And so when they sang it, I sang along with it. A few minutes later, when they sang De Colores, I go, used to teach
That one,
my kids.
Yeah, Mark was with us when we saw that, and we all said, Jim has taught us that one. I've heard Jim sing that.
One of my favorite songs.
Yeah.
When you're going to take up concertina?
Well, but your question begs the question for all of us is, who is the concertina player in our life, and how do we listen to that concertina?
Yeah.
Because that type of player is often an odd voice to hear.
Yeah.
Right? Doesn't quite speak the same way other voices speak. And how do we listen? And if I'm correct that it was Amarante who was doing all that stuff, what is it calling me to do that might be challenging or difficult? Do I go and set the sign on fire? Because this concertina that nobody else listens to somehow told me.
Yeah, I think, what's interesting is the word that's coming to mind in the moment here is catalyst, is if I choose to be a catalyst, and what are the consequences or what are the results of choosing or becoming a catalyst? And yet we sometimes need to cross that line and just be willing to take a lead.
Yeah, you're exactly right, Catherine. Let me frame it just a little bit differently. Amarante, in some ways, could be seen as one of the least powerful characters in the book, in that he was the oldest, had very little physical strength to be able to change things. But it could be argued that as a catalyst, he was one of the strongest characters. And so those of us who maybe don't have the physical or political power that we used to have, are we able to be the catalyst in some way to somebody else doing things? Is our little contribution that which changes the load and shifts it all over?
Well, what I liked about him is that he had fire in his belly. He still had spirit.
He did.
And I think that's, I enjoy people like that, and that, you know, he had a burning in him, and he wouldn't let it be quenched.
Yeah.
Feisty.
Yeah, he is feisty. And the hard part is that life often it shuts us down that way if we let it, and we have to choose to continue to do that. Louis.
He woke up in the morning, looked in the mirror, and said, "Thank you, God, for giving me another day."
Wasn't that an amazing first line to set the stage for everything? Right?
I saw God there. I really did.
Yeah.
I
Because sometimes my first thought in the morning is, oh, my knee aches. Or whatever it is that today is part of me. Right? And how do we say that? How do we choose to say today something miraculous is going to happen? I love that they used the town of Milagro, miracle, right? What miracle is waiting for us?
Well, there was a lot of things about the names, because the one guy mispronounced Joe and called him Mandragon.
Yeah.
And oh no, Mondrago.
Yeah,
And I thought,
Mondragon.
Mandragon, yes.
Right?
And another place was where God was when the wind came and saved the papers from being burned.
Yes, absolutely, right? And what are those miracles like that are beyond most of our controls, but where somehow the concertina player steps in?
Yeah.
Right?
Right. Yeah.
And that got everyone to the meeting, didn't it?
It did.
Where, of course, they fought with each other and didn't quite solve it, but things began to happen.
But it raised awareness.
It did.
That's what Ruby was the heart of the village, and she raised awareness. There was not coming together then, but it planted the seed, and I think that's the whole part of this Milagro, is planting the seed.
It is. And if you think about it, Bloom had done a whole lot of work that way, right? He was that type of lawyer. He was the champion of small causes, but he was also tired and said, do I want to do it one more time? And Ruby was the one who said, yes, you do, right?
Yep.
Just the way she acted in that meeting, got him to just show up and then said, Charlie's come to be able to talk to us. And Charlie knew that wasn't true, but stepped into that role anyway.
Yeah.
Right?
My question is, and maybe I just missed it, but what was the petition seeking? Even at the end, Ruby, when confronted by Mr. Bloom, who says, yeah, they all signed it tonight, but they'll all regret it tomorrow.
Yeah.
And she says, well, let's just celebrate the fact that they signed it tonight. But I think that's one of those enigmas, an ambiguity.
It was against
What
the
they were
giant
looking for.
company. It was against the big guy, the company.
Yeah.
They didn't want them
Development.
in there.
Yeah.
The developer, yeah.
Yeah, but I think what I hear in Randy's question is not necessarily what the wording of it is, but what did it actually do? And how did it actually change? And will it ultimately have the far-reaching effect of what we hope for? And that's the tough part about many political questions. Sometimes what we're trying to do is just find the community together, whether or not that community in this moment actually changes the thing we're against. Right? Sometimes we have to get together and remind ourselves that it's not just me against the world, but it's us standing here in a space together. Because who knows, they may not be able to shut off the development around them, right? Development is pretty persistent, right? And pretty insistent on the good that it brings in from its perspective.
But in this case, they got it to the governor and he said, put it on the back burner.
Yeah,
That was the key there. Put it,
Yeah.
and they weren't going to do it.
yeah. But the question is, how long does it stay on the back burner? And when does money come back up and say, Governor, guess what? Maybe not this governor, but the next governor.
Oh, that's the next movie. We don't have to watch.
We don't have to watch it. Yeah, but that's the ongoing issue: is how do we continue to stand and make progress even in the midst of what doesn't completely fix everything? Because the things like power and money, they are very strong influences in this world, right?
Yep.
And not necessarily in negative ways. There's things that power and influence in politics can do, right? That help if we allow it. But there's also times when that same stuff turns around and seems to work against that which we've been working towards.
And we're going to be witnessing it right around us. How about the development down in Benson threatening the San Pedro River?
That's
Now,
right.
reading the paper that right across the line up in Pinal County
Yeah.
is this clever maneuver on the part of the Land Development Committee to sell off parcels of public land.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so it's happening.
And there continually needs to be people who will stand up and say that's not right. Right? No matter how much the border wall goes in, I have friends of mine that are standing very strongly to say that's still not a good thing.
Yeah.
Even if some people have already written it in as, of course it's just there, sorry, battle's over. Right?
Yeah.
So at least part of it is, what's your battle? You know, what is the concertina player speaking into your heart, your life?
Well, I think, Jim, with our mental health ministry, the constant challenge is to continue to educate people about issues around mental health and to reduce the stigma of mental illness.
That's right.
So that I see as the mission of that committee, and I'm real involved in that.
That's right. And bottom line is, you're not going to solve it all today.
Well,
Right.
not today, maybe not tomorrow either.
Maybe not even tomorrow. That's right. But if we look back, we're at a better place then. In the book that we're reading in our other class, one of the things that the author Ibram Kendi says is that the black man in America both gets heartened by the fact that we have continually made strides towards better, but also looks and says, but there's a whole bunch that stands against that too, because we've also built up things that make it harder for someone of color. And the question is are we continually helping stoke the first that we are making strides, rather than the second that we are not? Because that could be true in anything. If we go back to water rights, we have done some marvelous things, and we've done some horrendous things that we've moved forward. And how do we continue to further the first rather than the second? One of the points he makes about water in America is that there are hundreds of communities. I think he said 400 communities that have worse water standards here in America than what Flint, Michigan has.
Ooh.
Scott.
The thing that is encouraging to me, I guess, is I think we're at a different place in terms of public awareness on a number of things. I was talking about the fact of probably the Milagro situation being confined basically to the people directly involved. And that's been the case a lot on mental illness. It's been the case a lot on racial issues. And I think the things that are happening now, the Black Lives Matters, but a lot of the publicity around the killing of people of color, but the fact that so many of these cases are around people that have mental issues, and that they've ended up in the person with the mental issues being killed rather than helped. And I think we're at a new point where people are starting to understand that a different kind of approach is needed. And I know in these areas for myself, it's something that I've been pretty oblivious about in many ways, and becoming much more aware.
So in some ways, Scott, what I hear you saying is you are Herbie, the sociologist that comes from afar, has no clue about this village, but that in some ways chooses to allow yourself to be converted by the village, converted by Amarante, to see something different than what you had seen. That's not a bad thing to be, right? But it always takes us having to step away from our normal and into whatever this moment is calling into us. It means that we're going to get some of the backlash of, well, 20 years ago, you voted for this kind of bill, and now you're saying you're not for that. And we need to be able to say, well, 20 years ago, I wasn't who I am today. That I've allowed myself to continue to be affected by the concertina. And I guess the follow-up question is, and why haven't you? Right? Why aren't you listening to that music that's calling us forward?
Well, on another issue, the police say, well, I was just following the protocol. And so many times we've heard this, we know protocol has to be changed. It has to be looked at every single place. So
it's time for us not to listen to just that and give it the value that it wants to have, right?
What's the film for next week? What's the film for next week?
I will put that back up for you. Thank you for reminding us again. Here are the films for, the next little while. And I will get this out to us too, especially if you have given me your email address. If you haven't, get that. So next week we are watching Beatriz at dinner. I will have a copy here in the office if you'd like to borrow it. After that, you can see the other ones that are there. So I will send this to you when we are done here.
Marvelous.
All right. You guys chose some good movies. The one you have to finish choosing is November 25th, because I had a whole bunch of them I didn't want to not look at. And so I gave you 3 different ideas of what we could watch. They're all marvelous, different views of the racial issues in America type of story. If Beale Street Could Talk, Green Book, or The 13th. So at some point we're going to have to choose between those 3.
Cool.
Or you can watch whichever one and we can talk about all 3 of them. But each one has a lot by itself. All right. So if you don't think I have your email address yet, then please get it to me so that I can get that to you. So watch Beatriz.
Sure.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a good week.
All right. You too. Bye bye.
Everyone have a good week. Thanks.